Hello, everybody, and welcome to another session of Panic with Friends. I hope people are past the panic stage and now kind of getting, a sense of where this is going, or at least how we manage this. This session has been very interesting. That we have been bringing together leaders from different industries, coming together to talk about how they're addressing or managing the panic among employees, among customers. How are they seeing the world? How do they see the post-pandemic world? And we have been learning together. The fun thing for me has been the audience response. The most response that I get, or the common response that I've been getting is, thanks for doing this. It makes us feel much better when we hear that the leaders also talking about that we really don't have a clear idea of where this is going or how we handle this. So that gives us a comfort that we are in this together, which is an interesting feedback from a lot of the audience members. I want to first thank the sponsors. The Center for Innovation has been doing innovation stuff, innovation work with startups and new companies and established corporations. And we have had some great sponsors like Genia, CapBlue, Maori Construction, Lofner Patel, and I thank all these guys. And I also want to thank Kelly Logan and her team from Government Technology Institute, who have been supporting us throughout this process. And so with that, let's get to the esteemed panel that we have today. It's a very interesting group of people from geographically different areas, industries different. So let's hear from them about who they are, what their companies are about, and most interestingly for me, have their role changed since this pandemic, or what they have learned about themselves. So let's start with Laurie. Laurie, I think you're still muted.
Thank you. Jay, thank you for having me on the panel today. Hello, everyone. I'm the CEO of Beyond. Beyond is a M&A consultancy, a mergers and acquisitions consultancy, and we help small and lower mid-market businesses buy, sell, and scale. So although as CEO, my role has not necessarily changed, Beyond is doing more outreach through webinars, social media, reaching out to customers, and we're doing this because now, believe it or not, is a great time to position for business leaders to position themselves and their companies to thrive, both through the pandemic, recovery, and beyond.
Thanks, Laurie. Catherine?
Thanks, Jay. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody today. I'm Katrin Hillner. I'm President and CEO of PC Network. PCN is a technology service provider. We help partners and customers worldwide automate and securely manage DNS, DHCP, and IP address management in hybrid clouds. Our managed BDI services are complemented by an ITIL service desk capability, as well as project management services. And we're very excited to have newly launched some security, GRC, governance, risk, and compliance offerings as well. We partner with tier 1 systems integrators and service providers, as well as delivering directly to enterprise customers. My role feels like it's changed quite a bit. The core tasks has been the same, but the way that I'm engaged in them feels really profoundly different. I'm spending a lot of time looking at the numbers. I've always been responsible for the numbers, but there has been so much shift. I think we went through 4 planning cycles within a 6-week period that normally take us 3 months to do once. So the world really has been changing. I have to say we've gotten a lot better at it now. There's nothing like repetition. We've streamlined some of it, and my leadership team has a much better grasp of dependencies and the real financial drivers for the business through this exercise. The second thing that's really changed for me is how I feel like I'm leading. You know, the professional has really become personal. Although everybody is in this together, we are experiencing it in very different ways, depending on what industry segment you're working in, depending on what your spouse's role is, depending on how your children are adapting. I'm a working mom. I have 2 middle schoolers and a high schooler who are learning from home now. The whole parenting piece is, vastly different than it was before. And I also feel like individuals have a different way of reacting to the radical uncertainty that we have, right? We have different chemistry and different mental health profiles. So as this pandemic and as this uncertainty has expanded in time, really spending a lot of time with my team on self-care, with our partners, like calibrating how everybody's doing. It's really a different way. We've always been a tightly knit kind of group, but I feel like we have developed an intimacy and a language that you wouldn't have had in a professional context prior to this experience.
Well, thanks, Kat.
Sure. Thanks, Jay, and a pleasure joining you all. My name is Dan Clough. I serve as managing partner for Gartner Consulting in the Pennsylvania region, which is a relatively small team of client-facing advisors amongst a very large global research and advisory firm. And as mentioned through this, I oversee our consulting operations in Pennsylvania and help out regionally in state and local. As far as how it's changed, I agree with Katrin. The core focus hasn't changed, but a couple of things stand out, mostly around the areas of ways of working, and I have a feeling we're going to probably get to that. One way is the intensity that my and our days have taken, both in terms of the number of initiatives we take on in each day and the numbers of hours worked. Some days it seems like that endless WebEx from 7 to 7 with bad hair all around and kids popping in and out, saying they ran out of cereal or backed into the mailbox or whatever it is. It's nonstop, and we all go to bed tired. And I think this points out the balance we thought we didn't have in the days before, but we actually did and are trying to find it again. That's one thing. The other larger impact that I've seen is making sure my and our staff aren't pulled too hard into the madness of the remote world to the point that their life is impacted. A lot of junior staff aren't prepared as we might be to make that clean break from the day. Most will sit in front of their laptops and in front of their screen until their work's done, and we in leadership are sometimes way too good at coming up with extra things to do. So what I found is, as a general rule of thumb, if we're working 10-hour days, our staff might be working 12 or more, and in my view, that's a bad thing in the long haul. So I'd say that the biggest change in focus is about learning to be more productive, not spending more time, and that starts, in my view, checking in more with your teams and encouraging our management teams to balance and prioritize workload, but it really starts with us.
So that, it's interesting, I'll pick up on something that Dan mentioned about the kids running in the bad hair day. The irony of this is we can't even get a haircut, but we are in front of a camera all the time. And, so it's like trying to figure out, I'm still trying to figure out where am I looking? Where's the camera looking? Where's my speaker? Just all of these things. And, the last, Panic with Friends session, I was sharing this. Like you said, there was multiple calls, and I'm using different technologies because in one, like external one, I was on a Zoom call, then I was on an Adobe Connect, then I went on a Microsoft Live. And some of them you can create your own backgrounds, and some you can't. And, so when you get up and suddenly, walk or something, it's when you realize, well, you are fully on camera right now. You don't have the background. So it's like these simple things all the way to really, the interesting thing to hear from you guys would be, Laurie, I'll come back to you, is while the role hasn't really changed, there is still a need for addressing the panic or the worry that the employees have, right? I mean, am I going to be laid off? Like, how is this, going to impact? Like Catherine mentioned, the kids are at home. How long can I work from home? Is that going to change? All of this. So how do you address the panic? How do you address, employees?
We work with CEOs and business owners mostly. And panic is a great word because it grabs attention right away. And what we're seeing is really more concern. They are seeking advice and perspective. They have a thirst for knowledge, and they're help with identifying and prioritizing the things that they need to be focused on. When somebody is afraid, there's an evolutionary survival mechanism that causes their attention to narrow. In fact, physiologically, your optical depth of view increases. They can become focused on what is right in front of them today, sometimes at the expense of tomorrow. They may not be aware or be increasing their field of view so that they take in all the relevant facts, and that causes them to jump to conclusions. Also, folks are subject to something called attention bias, and people tend to process information in ways that match their worldview. The world has changed, and so if your view hasn't, you could be focusing on the wrong things. So I bring that to everybody's attention because if we're all aware of that within ourselves and within the people that we work with and we serve, then we can help ourselves and them avoid making unwise decisions.
Interesting, interesting feedback, Laurie. Yeah, so that, because you look at, working with other CEOs. So Catherine, coming to you, you run your own company, you have partners, your employees, and like you said, you were reworking the numbers. So it's interesting. It would be interesting for the audience to hear what's your perspective. Is your employees, how do you even know that if your employees are worried that am I going to get laid off or who is going to get laid off?
We had to confront some pretty stark realities really early in March after some contracts furloughed. We're fortunate in that we have a portfolio of industry segments and offerings. So probably about a third of our revenue for this year was really travel industry oriented, and some contracting kind of role oriented, which were very easy to kind of turn off. And we did, in the middle of March, affect a reduction in force. And that process, I think, has allowed the remaining teams to understand that we took the steps that we needed to, we acted quickly, we gave generous severance packages to people, understanding that they're navigating in a period of time where there's a lot of uncertainty, to make sure that medical coverage and such is taken care of. So we acted pretty strongly to be able to be in a position to weather. And then we are just very intentional in our communications, right? We're pulsing the team. It feels like we're crossing antennas all the time. What I've noticed is not only are employees thinking about our customer and our business, they're also very focused on their immediate families, their environments. I mean, people are being impacted in a very different way, even though we're all in it together. So it requires us to calibrate really to the individual. And so, we sort of took those steps up front, and now we're actively communicating and staying connected. And we have a lot of good, new, exciting pieces that are coming together for the business as well. So, it was a mixed bag, and we took the necessary steps.
How do you manage? So Dan, coming to you, it's interesting. You have a kind of a dual role because people look up to a Gartner to tell them what to do. Companies look up to Gartner and say, because I had a conversation with the managing director of another big consulting firm, and I said, so what's the advice you're giving these days? And he said, well, to be honest, Jay, we are not really giving too much advice. We are also watching, and because we don't want to be caught flat-footed because we really don't know, and we are not in the in this healthcare space, and it has a lot of dependency around how this health issue plays out. So given Gartner is a big name, and I'm sure people are looking up, the companies are asking you for advice.
Well, I'll answer it partly with that, how we're managing panic, and it's interesting in professional services, as Katrin and Lori know, there's always these two sides to how you approach things. You have your own staff to worry about, but you also have 8, 10, 20 some client environments that they're very unique to manage as well. And one observation is you're not necessarily practicing internally as well what you're recommending clients practice, and that's just the reality of it. It's kind of funny to think about. But I think the trick for us all is being able first to show calm and encouragement while calmly freaking out on occasion underneath in our own way. It's kind of like parenting in that way, I guess. But really, it's about being real and communicating more in a genuine way to prove you're in it with them and are going through it with everything that you have, investing. And I think that's probably the source, if I were to guess, behind the statement that consultant gave you about not doing a lot of consulting. Really on the client side, it's important to assume a couple of things during any event-driven thing like COVID. One is I agree with the notion that was made that clients get running so hard that they get tunnel vision. So they're not so much really interested in you being really smart, but helping them stay calm and focused, I think is the big thing. Also, it's really important to understand that they're probably up to speed on the basics and the obvious. And all running on a president's schedule, so to speak. You get 5 minutes at a time. So if you come with an idea, be clear and come with a very simple solution. One slide, 5 minutes, focused on a fix. And if not, just call them and let them know that you're there and check in on them and see how they're doing to give them support.
So I teach strategy for the MBA program at Mason, and also help with the issues program. And one of the things we talk about in leadership is clarity, right? I mean, you're all in that, and there's supposed to be clarity. And paradox is something we are not comfortable with. We try to get to, here is black and white or right and wrong. And this is one of those times where I think paradox makes more sense. Scenario planning makes more sense because we really don't know how this is going to evolve. So given that kind of a scenario, how do you, things change every day. Like, if you just take Virginia was supposed to open. There was this whole information that the governor is going to open Virginia. And then like 2 days before that date, he announced, well, Northern Virginia is not going to open because there are still cases. So in these kind of, like last minute changes, which you absolutely cannot control and do not control, how do you manage in these kind of challenging
absolutely,
times?
Jay. I think that's a great question, and I think you had teed up a pre-question for us before we gathered here on what's one thing we learned about ourselves during this period of time. And the thing that I've learned about myself is that when I lay down the mantle of really understanding, because normally I lead with understanding, right? I'm a leader, I'm an MBA, I've done a lot of things in my life. I lead with I know, right? And then let's fill in the things I don't know. And there is no way to have that stance in the current dynamics. So it has been interesting and new, and I've been learning how to put down that feeling that I need to know. And it's actually opened up conversations with my team and my partners and my customers where I am learning and we are making sense of things as they change together instead of anyone bringing, you know, a clear picture of what it is. And I think staying flexible, staying fluid, you know, we have the advantage of being a small, nimble player. So part of that's in our DNA. But the tectonic shifts that are happening, like you say, it makes us spin as well. So it is the nature of these times, and I think we have to look at it not as a problem, but as sort of one of the defining aspects of this shared experience that we have.
For me, the pandemic came home very clearly when Virginia went into lockdown in mid-March. And I found myself significantly distracted. Of course, the world had flipped upside down. And it took me a while, number one, to realize how distracted I was, and then to figure out what I needed to focus on, and then to move forward. Having said all that, it has been said that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And since we are in this period of enforced isolation and seclusion, it's also a time of greater introspection. And so looking at how do I improve my business? What changes do I need to make in my life? How can I help other people during this crisis? Using the crisis to improve all these areas. And just having that experience brought home to me so very clearly. That's what I've discovered new.
So Dan, the same question, like, because information is changing almost on a daily basis or like every hour.
Again, huge question, and so much to unpack from it. You know, really it brings up a couple of trends. One is that we, of course, have a need to be organized and have contingencies around options, not necessarily an answer. They don't write a book for this stuff. It's up to us to kind of write it. And I like the statement that we have to kind of put down absolutes, put down our tendency to want an immediate answer. So when you look at it from that perspective, we need to be organized, but we have a tendency to overplan in these situations and maybe underact. And, you know, the stories of other event-driven situations are pretty interesting as far as crises that had the same mix of panic and things changing forever, getting back to a new normal. And what I like to do is look back at a few of them, like we all are. So I think of 9/11 to use one that's overused. So I was located in D.C. at the time, and you know, after the smoke settled a little bit, you know, we spent weeks stocking our cars with bug-out bags, didn't go to theaters and public events, had contingency plans and alternate sites, and weaved in and out of standoff barriers going to work. But you know, in the end, we learned a couple of lessons, and a couple of things lasted. You know, men take off their shoes and TSA lines and their belts, and there's some big different banking rules. But in the end, we got back to this new normal, and life moved on, and we're really good at adapting to it. So the trick at this point is trying our hardest to take a long view in what those things are, and understanding the near view. We just have to be very agile. So the key is targeting and adapting to those things that will last. You know, if I were to predict, and I think you had a question later on in this, I think is that in a couple of years we're going to be better at responding to a lot of these things, and more proactive with a lot of the measures, fortifying gaps in the supply chain, or maybe temperature checks at venues. A lot of babies next spring, but you know, in the end, we've got to focus now on kind of what matters and take the long view as best as we can. And that's really tough. The point on layoffs and cost cuts. It's hard when you're sitting around a conference table with your finance folks and your OGC to focus on those things, but you really have to, and that's what's going to be left in the end. Again, they don't really write a book for this, so being bold in the process and being very genuine and clear with folks is really what matters while you take the long view.
Can I just tag on to something that both Dan and Lori had said? Not wasting the crisis. I mean, it is amazing to me how much digital adoption has been accelerated during this time with the massive shift to work from home and telemedicine and remote learning and on and on and on. I run a technology business. I'm at one side of the spectrum of using technology, but if I think about, my kids' pediatricians, their teachers, the whole world has moved towards this digital experience in a way that never could have happened without this crisis. And when we think about, it's not like society was put on pause and then we're going to take the pause button off and we're going to continue along our way. We're in week 9 of seriously changed behaviors and changed experience with technology, understanding that you can do piano lessons with someone who isn't in your house, understanding that you can do, follow-up visits with your doctor. There's a whole set of new societal norms which we have experimented with at a rate that would have been unimaginable, because it's always the people piece that's the hardest when you're driving technology change. It's not the technology that's hard, it's changing how we engage with it. And I think to Dan's point, and also to Lori's, you don't want to waste this crisis. We actually have the opportunity, because we're out of the groove and everything is a bit upended, to think about how do we as society want these pieces to get put back together. How would you do it if you had more of a blank slate where you're recreating new grooves that may serve us as in a macro way, much better than the way the old norms had served us. And just because it's a bit of a passion point for me, I did want to make sure that I just, said in this forum, the impact of COVID on Black and Latino communities within America has been so much greater than on the average American. And if you think about those disparities and what they tell us about access to healthcare and access to different, the role in essential services and the role in lower income segments, we have to use this, to Lori's point, as an opportunity to figure out how we want to move forward from this moment and collectively confront the reality that some of the things weren't working that well. And we can have an ability to create a different future, but we need a conversation that's at a different level than just, am I going to make sure that I can make my payroll and my employees are okay and my kids are taken care of? We actually have to say, look, there are serious segments of the economy that are going to have a hard time coming back. And we knew that there were going to be trends in automation with work that was going to have a significant impact within this time frame too. So there's been an acceleration that I think really calls us to ask those bigger questions and apply our best thinking to how should this look? Sorry.
So, Catherine, it's interesting. So because I want to get into innovations, right? We've kind of talked about the challenges, how you are reacting, and all of that. But one of the key things about these conversations is I want to focus on, because all of you touched on how the world has changed. And I was reading a couple of things that San Francisco, which is kind of the leader in going green, have banned reusable grocery bags. So this is, something they implemented a few years back, and now they banned it. Another thing that's interesting that I read is WHO in August 2019, that's like less than a year back, said video game addiction is officially considered a mental disorder, right? And then the same WHO in just April 1st said WHO is recommending video games as an effective way to stop the spread of COVID-19. So it's like, so coming back to this, so what are you seeing as innovations out there? And what are some of the really cool things that's happening out there?
To your point about the WHO, I think there's a time and place. Right now, we need everybody to stay at home as much as possible. And if video games do the job, great. And we'll worry about the addiction problem later. And we need to worry about the addiction problem, not to minimize that. More to the innovation and new business processes. Right now in our business, we're taking a look at our marketing and sales and how we're reaching our clients and how we adjust, because everything is being done remotely. In the mergers and acquisitions business, face-to-face is very important. You need that nonverbal communication. You need to see where that person is coming from, because you've got to know, can you trust this person and can you do business with this person? And of course, that's important in other areas for any sort of negotiations as well. Right now, you can't do that. So you have to glean what you can from your remote communications. Another area that we're looking at is how we're spending our time every day, the tasks that we perform, and those tasks that are not a good use of our time. So how can we get these things done? So more delegation is taking place, and we're increasing our automation so that we can be more effective in what we're doing.
Other companies. So, Catherine, so the same question, like some of the innovations, and I think you mentioned about the whole digital adoption, and I think somebody from the audience, and I want to reach out to the audience also. Please post your questions, comments, because as we will quickly get through this conversation and we'll run out of time. So please post your questions early enough so we can pull them up. So one of the audience question also, which kind of ties into this innovation, is examples of digital adoption.
Well, the larger shifts are around being able to work from anywhere, and more of the activities becoming distributed. Things that you would not have imagined distributed teams being able to do, you are now seeing distributed teams doing. So I think that's a big factor. The other thing, and it's unfortunately it's a negative, but it is a tenor of these times. There's been tremendous innovation in the cyber threat area. If you look at how our connectivity, which is becoming ever more increasingly, foundational, and will be even more so in the advent of 5G and the technologies that are coming into play. The cyber actors, the bad actors, have seized this time of crisis as a way to, double down. There are, I've read different reports up to 4x, 5x the number of campaigns being launched, taking advantage of the increased vulnerability that all the remote access kind of represents, and also the distractedness that we all have in juggling the world today. And it really, it's created a fire in my belly to figure out how the cyber game needs to be changed to make us a worse target to be going after, right? There's just too much incentive and not enough cost being levied, and the dynamics are so detrimental. When you really dig into the costs and the data and the risks, we would never allow this to happen in the real world, right? The way that it has sort of just taken over in the digital sphere. I've heard it actually say that we today are at like September 10th in cyberspace, right? We are really 24 hours away from potential significant, and it's metaphorical, right? It's been very challenging there, but it has been accelerating, and it's very concerning. I think that's an area where we're spending time innovating offerings and convening stakeholders that we think can help us offer solutions.
So, Dan, again, the Gartner is where people look up to. What's the trends? What's changing? And I think maybe you can share some secrets.
Yeah, we love our data for sure at Gartner, but if you took a cross section of the folks that are on this call, they'll probably come back to the two things that I would mention, and I think they've already been mentioned by Lori and Katrin. So my thinking here is that when we emerge, and by the way, I think it'll be a process across each sector, not a date, obviously. Our world will be two things. One is more automated, more quickly, and two will require a focus starting now on adjusting our ways of working to upskill, reskill, retrain staff to make it all come together, which I think is the biggest challenge that we're going to be facing. So to kind of break those areas down, I guess, as far as AI or RPA or IA, all the intelligent automation pieces, we're seeing a rapid uptick across the board in implementation of AI and process automation. So it's for the reasons that they were before, not just in the private sector, but in government and higher education. And this is ranging anywhere from installing basic bots to automate some back office function to enhance call centers, pattern recognition, cognitive instances, that type of thing, predictive analytics. So the great thing about a crisis, and this is mentioned several times already, is that it magnifies weaknesses and makes people to come together fast to find fast solutions. So it's a great accelerator. The bad news is the same thing, is that we run into the risk of accelerating past ourselves, which I think is part of where I'm going. So as we accelerate into things like automation, we're buying lots of bots and tools, so we have to make sure we're paying close attention to consistency in tools and platforms as we do it to make it efficient. Business priority for whether we even need to automate or should. Most importantly, workforce readiness for the environment is key. So that kind of leads me to the second point, which is the ways of working, and I think it's the most important. And Jay, when I think back, I think you mentioned this before the session. It reminds me of a panel you and HU put together a year or so back where we focused on innovation. And one of the topics we discussed with 70 or so IT leaders was the reality coming to organizations in automation. And when we asked the room about their chief concerns, it wasn't about the technology or whether they thought they could implement it. It was their staff's ability to adapt to it. So this is a whole room of technologists. So the conversation rightfully went right back to people, which is ways of working. And in fact, I think almost all in the room felt that their staff lacked at that time even the basic data literacy and some of the business skills needed to make this shift. And that's what the data reflects in industry. I think we were saying then that by 2021, 80% of emerging technologies will have AI foundations. And that's just a year or so away. I think that's true. However, to the point on acceleration, it's happening even faster. And some surveys are even showing that 80% of global companies are indicating their skills gaps, have major skill gaps in their workforce right now, with a large percentage of those needing to switch occupations or find new skills. So much of this is that switch to automation. And of course, I don't mean robots replacing humans, but in leveraging AI to get more done with less, smaller staff, tighter budgets. So in the process, we're requiring our people to adapt as fast as our technology to make it work. But in most cases, this is going to require a lot of retraining. So ways of working COVID, so to speak, I think will include the ability to rapidly update and reskill the workforce to adapt to a new environment. Should start, in my view, with taking the time now to do a proper skills assessment to align that kind of future business operating model with skills, and then train on those soft spots so we don't get ahead of ourselves. So positive innovation from COVID-19, just like any crises, but accelerated risk along with it that we have to focus on.
So Dan, I'd like to follow up on that great point, and also Katrin, the point that you made about people, that there is going to be a tremendous need for retraining and reskilling as we come out of this pandemic, and that has only been accelerated by the pandemic. However, whereas things like cross-training were only incorporated for sort of emergency measures, now you're going to see a lot more of that. That's going to be necessary moving forward, not only as a bridge to get from where you're at now to where you need to be, but to make folks more interchangeable, so that as you're moving forward, then you can help people increase their skills, not only to increase their motivation, but to increase their loyalty. And so this can be a good thing for everybody, but the flexibility that you need is easier for certain personalities than others. Also, to follow up on the post-COVID world and trends, I see another trend that has been accelerated by the pandemic, and that is moving manufacturing production closer to the point of sale. Already a number of companies were looking to get out of China, both due to security and quality issues, but now that's accelerated even further due to supply issues. So you're seeing the United States and other developed countries starting to look at bringing manufacturing back onshore for critical things like pharmaceuticals and food. You're also looking, and the government also, to make sure that they have sufficient quantities of things like PPE, personal protective equipment.
So, we're almost getting close to the time. And so one of the things that I wanted to get out from all of you is, because it kind of started with that conversation around the retraining. So for the folks that's out there listening in, when we talk about automation, I want to read two quotes. This is interesting. These are two names that pretty much everybody listens to, and now it's like, so the first one is from Bill Gates, and he says, this is like a world war, except in this case, we are all on the same side, and I see global innovation as the key to limiting the damages. So he has been talking about, this is a big issue, and, we need. And then here is another quote, and this is from Elon Musk, right? And he says, reaction to coronavirus has taken over the mind space of the world to a degree that it is shocking. It seems like some people really wanted the panic, and they went quite crazy. So, it's like coming from completely two opposite sides. And we all talked about, there is a shift and there is a new world coming out. And I think Mark Cuban said there will be an America 2.0 at the end. And so what those opportunities will look like is what everybody should be watching. So given that kind of, people are still talking about, should this be a big issue or shouldn't be, without touching on the whole healthcare issue, but what do you see as the post-pandemic world? What's the new normal? I know, we talked about we shouldn't be talking about black and white, and we should be in paradox and scenario planning. But still, from where you sit, what do you see as the post normal? Something, not a couple of few things that our
Sure. More broadly, just to start, I think those are great statements. I've heard them, and it's kind of one of those. They're all right. I love the notion that when you get in a bind, it doesn't matter personally or professionally. The phrase they don't write a book for this, and they don't. So in a sense, they're all right. But just to hit on a few themes, what I think is very interesting is I'm constantly looking at organizations and how they react. Internally and externally to this event-driven event, to COVID, and those that get ahead of the curve and those that are behind the curve, those that wait and are reactive, which I think is part of this, and those that aren't. And there's always a risk every step of the way at certain milestones that there's a certain point that you absolutely have to communicate something. You have to take a position. And most folks, because of compliance or other governing bodies or OGC teams or whatever it is, can't quite step out and make the business statement that they want. And so when I look at Musk's statement and others, I say, well, good for you. One, just generally speaking, I think if there's one thing to learn from this is to be organized and plan well, but be bold with a position. Be organized with contingencies and options, but don't be afraid to literally write a headline for your organization or company and execute around it. So with those contingencies worked in, that kind of deliberate action or deliberate statements calms the troops, creates confidence in your organization, and can position you more strongly in the end. The only things that you really have to be right about are the things that are going to affect your bottom line in 2 years, not necessarily right now. And so, going back to that 9/11 example, it's like what are those things that are still going to be left in the end? If you're in entertainment, do you have to worry about bigger spaces, to worry about head count and capacity and physical distancing? I don't know. Do we all have to start concerning ourselves with health checks going into offices? Not sure. But I think it'll vary per industry. And I think identifying those one or two things that will stick hardest with our industry and be there in the long run are the things we need to plan around as we come out of this. And again, I just go back to the notion of people. If you put people first, you can't be hurt. Our bottom lines are going to go down either way, but if you focus on people in the end, two really good things will happen. One is they'll see you're with them the whole way, and also you'll retain them more because they're paying attention to everybody else and your competitors as well. So really focus on people, focus on making bold, clear statements and identifying those one or two things. I don't think there's one or two magical things. I think it's going to vary significantly by industry. To just pick on one, for professional services, I'd say because all of our clients are getting better like we are at doing things remotely, I'd say probably maybe 25-30% of our delivery will be done remotely in the future because we figured out how to do it together. So just a couple of examples, but I think the trends are the most important. And I like how some folks are stepping out and kind of calling the fence on it.
Yeah, I'm really focused because of where we deliver services in the cybersecurity new normal. I think with the shift to digital collaboration and the data that's being exchanged increasingly, that is going to be a dominant requirement for protecting our way of life. And I think that the attention and the investment and the standards bodies around it and the requirement to really have our houses in good order, the cyber hygiene, and it very much plays into the skills issues and gaps that Dan identified as well, making sure that we have enough people and also that we're funding it enough. I mean, that's one of the challenges too, doing things maybe the way they should be done might cost a lot more than doing things to get them done. And we've been in a period where the desire to to innovate and deploy and to experiment has been higher than the desire to control and make sure that we don't have vulnerabilities. And there's a tension there, right, where you need to be able to experiment, but you also can't put privacy data at risk, can't allow mission critical infrastructure to be hijacked. I mean, the way that we are operating now requires a different security mind frame. And I think we're going to come out the other end of this as a society focused on that. And we're going to travel a lot less to Dan,
I agree, certainly with the points that have been made, and just the whole trend towards doing everything remotely, whether it's talking to your colleagues or it's getting a pizza delivered, or in certain isolated cases, having your drugs delivered. They're starting to do using drones to do drug delivery, especially in rural places. But I want to touch on something I haven't heard anybody else mention, and that is the societal changes that we as a society, and certainly we as business owners, are going to need to come out of this in to be much more agile and to be able to address change much more quickly. And to, when we have another crisis like this, because God forbid, I don't want that, but reasonably speaking, we're going to see this again. There's going to be another pandemic. That we react, that we're much better prepared to react, and that we do so much more rapidly. And so I think that's going to take a lot of forms, both at the level of society, but both as well as on the level of our businesses and in our personal lives.
Well, so thank you all for joining. I mean, each of these conversations, we really learn new things. And the other part of this is, as we do this every 2 weeks, right? So during those 2 weeks, like I mentioned and you all talked about, the information changes, environment changes. So the new group that comes in has a better perspective or a different perspective. And, so it's really interesting to me. And for where I sit, or my role is to support new startups, new entrepreneurs. And so I hear all these new ideas, and the most, Laurie mentioned about being agile and, quickly flexible and all that. We have a startup competition that we had, invited applicants from. About 25, 26 applicants came in. We did an initial vetting, they went through a process working with vendors, and we have 7 of them that's going to pitch in the finals on 26. The interesting thing was, one of those 7, so when they originally submitted this application, this was pre-pandemic, right? And so he came back and he said, hey, am I allowed to change my idea? And this was an idea that was picked. And so we initial reaction was, no, and then I thought, well, what is your new idea? And it had something to do with addressing the pandemic issue. And I said, well, if that's the case, maybe we should, we keep talking about being agile, so this is an opportunity. So we did that, and he resubmitted his whole idea, and it was a completely different one. And so this, in the startup world, it's very easy to change things very fast because it's a small team that's uniquely focused, and we call pivoting very easy. But in larger companies, I think it's a bigger challenge. And so one of the things I want to do is, as we wrap this session up, bring you back, a month or 2 from now, when things are in a different mode, and come back and talk about some of the things that you put in place or the plans that you put in place, how did that evolve? What changed? And how were you able to pivot? Because that's one of the interesting things that me having worked in a bigger, larger corporation and did my own startup is that, how quickly can you change? How quickly can you adapt or be flexible? Because that's one of the themes that all of you mentioned, that you have to be agile, flexible. But when you're a big company, and like Catherine mentioned about, 3 times revising the numbers, how often can you do that when the information is changing? So,
yes, if many business owners right now, they're looking to try to conserve cash in their businesses, and they want to take that cash and use it for different things. So if you're actually looking to free up cash, I've got a few quick ideas. Number one, do a tool inventory. If you are using all of your tools, great, but I bet you're not. And get rid of those that you are not using or that are being underutilized. You'll save hundreds to tens of thousands of dollars a month just doing that one thing. Also, if you're like most businesses, 20% of your customers bring in 80% of your revenue. Identify those 20% if you haven't already, and do everything you can to bring additional value to them and retain them going forwards.
Thank you, Jay. Pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jay.
Again,
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jay.
Great.
It's been great.
And I hope to have all of you back on one of the future panels.